2023 marked the deadliest year in the history of Mount Everest, with 17 lives tragically lost in a single season. Most people imagine that reaching the summit requires years of elite training and unparalleled expertise. However, today, anyone with sufficient funds can purchase a permit and attempt the climb. This accessibility has inadvertently fostered a terrifying trend. Individuals with almost no mountaineering experience are walking into a trap from which they cannot escape. Why would anyone risk everything for a photograph on a mountain? Welcome to Cold Case Files, where we uncover the chilling truths behind some of the world's most perilous adventures. Today, we delve into the stories of three inexperienced climbers who defied every warning and ultimately perished on the world's highest peak. Our first story is that of Shreya Shaklareen, a 33-year-old woman whose dream far outstripped her actual skills. Born in Kathmandu, Nepal, Shreya grew up with the majestic Mount Everest always looming in the distance. When she was just 9 years old, her father took her on a helicopter ride to see the peak from the air. Her parents told her how incredibly difficult it was to reach the top on foot, and that simple sentence planted a seed in her mind that would grow throughout her life. Later, she moved to Mumbai and eventually settled in Toronto, Canada, where she worked as a fashion buyer for a clothing chain and launched her own business, SOS Splash of Style Incorporated. Yet, even while living a bustling life in a flat city, the mountain's call was undeniable. She became determined to be the first South Asian woman from Canada to stand on the summit. To turn this dream into reality, Shreya and her husband Bruce made a massive sacrifice. They took out a second mortgage on their home, investing nearly $100,000 in the expedition. This was a life-altering sum of money, and when you spend that much, there's an overwhelming pressure to succeed. The thought of returning home and failure becomes unbearable. This mental state is often referred to as summit fever, where reaching the top becomes more important than staying alive. Shreya's training, however, did not align with the magnitude of the challenge. How did she prepare for the highest mountain on Earth? She didn't climb smaller peaks or spend months in freezing conditions. Instead, she walked around her neighborhood in Toronto, specifically tackling the hills near Dufferin Street and Eglinton Avenue. She carried a heavy 20-kilogram backpack and walked 19 kilometers every single day. While she also engaged in some karate, rock climbing, and cardio, she possessed almost no real mountaineering experience before departing for Nepal in 2012. Upon her arrival at base camp, red flags immediately began to appear. She had booked her climb with a company called Utmost Adventure Trekking, a new startup that had never successfully guided anyone to Everest summit before. They offered cheaper rates than the renowned companies, but lacked the expert knowledge crucial for keeping a beginner alive. During her training at the Khumbu Icefall, Shreya had to be taught how to put on her crampons, the metal spikes worn on boots for walking on ice. This is a fundamental skill that most climbers master years before even contemplating Everest. The senior Sherpa on her team grew so concerned about her slow pace that he reportedly refused to take her any higher than base camp. He clearly saw her lack of strength, but the company did not intervene. They allowed her to continue with two less experienced Sherpa guides. On May 18, 2012, Shreya began her final push to the summit from Camp 4. Most fit climbers can complete the round trip from this camp to the top and back in approximately 13 hours. It took Shreya a staggering 19 hours just to ascend. The mountain was incredibly crowded that day, and she became trapped in a massive traffic jam at the Hillary Step. Over 150 people were rushing to utilize a brief window of good weather, and the narrow, rocky path could only be traversed one person at a time. She stood in the freezing air for hours, waiting for her turn, breathing through her supplemental oxygen bottles. She was consuming her life support before even reaching the summit. On her way up, she encountered Ganesh Takuri, the owner of her trekking company, who was descending. He observed her extreme weakness and pleaded with her to turn back, emphasizing that she had spent too long in the death zone. Shreya brushed him off, declaring, "I am going to the top. There is no way I am going back." In a decision that many experts later criticized, Thakuri gave her his own last bottle of oxygen so she could continue. Shreya finally reached the summit at 2:20 p.m. on May 19th. This is dangerously late in the day. Most climbers aim to be heading down by 11 a.m. because the weather can change in an instant. Despite her exhaustion and dwindling oxygen supply, she spent 25 minutes on the peak, celebrating her achievement as the first South Asian woman from Canada to reach the top. But this victory was about to transform into tragedy. As soon as she began her descent, her body started to fail. She walked so slowly she could barely stand, and her speech became slurred. Her attention began to wander, a clear sign that her brain was not receiving enough oxygen. She was on her 9th bottle of oxygen, and it eventually ran out completely. Her Sherpas desperately tried to assist her, pushing and pulling her down the mountain towards an area called the balcony. They were practically carrying her. The temperature plummeted to -40°C, and the wind began to scream at 130 kilometers per hour. Shreya could no longer move her legs. As the sun set, she collapsed in the snow. Her last words to her guides were a heartbreaking plea, "Save me." She died that night at 10 p.m., having climbed for 27 straight hours. Her Sherpas had no choice but to leave her there, as they too were running out of oxygen and would have perished if they stayed. What followed her death was equally tragic. Because she died so high up, her body remained on the mountain for 10 days. Other climbers had to walk directly past her frozen body to reach the summit. One climber, Leanne Shuttleworth, recalled having to unclip her safety rope and maneuver around Shreya's body just hours after she died. Shreya was still clipped to the main climbing line, sitting in the snow in her bright red parka. Back in Toronto, her husband Bruce was woken up at 5:30 a.m. by a phone call. Initially, the news was good. They told him she had reached the top. He began celebrating with her friends. But a few hours later, the second call came, informing him she was gone. Bruce later expressed shock that the guides ever allowed her to go so high if they knew she was struggling. A team of 5 Sherpas eventually had to return to the death zone to retrieve her. They slogged through terrible weather for 2 days to bring her body down to Camp 2, where a helicopter could finally reach her. Her body was flown to Kathmandu, where she was cremated at a Hindu temple, witnessed by her grieving family. Her story sparked a huge debate in Canada and Nepal about why individuals with no experience are permitted to pay their way onto such a deadly mountain. But Shreya wasn't the only person who believed they could conquer the mountain with sheer willpower alone. In 2023, the world's highest peak claimed more lives than any other year in history. Among them was a 59-year-old teacher from India, Suzanne Leopoldina Jesus, from the state of Maharashtra. Suzanne had a very specific, historic mission. She wanted to become the first Asian woman with a pacemaker to scale Mount Everest. A pacemaker is a small device placed in the chest to help control the heartbeat. Suzanne had trekked to base camp in 2022 and felt she was ready for the peak. But she was about to discover that the upper slopes are an entirely different world. Suzanne's attempt was fraught with trouble from the very start of her training in March 2023. To prepare for the summit, climbers must undergo acclimatization exercises to see how their bodies cope with the thin air. One common exercise involves walking from base camp to a nearby location called Crampon Point. This is a very short distance of only 250 meters. For a fit climber, this walk typically takes between 15 and 20 minutes. Suzanne's performance during these exercises was a clear warning of the danger ahead. On her first attempt, it took her 5 hours to walk those 250 meters. On her second attempt, it took 6 hours. By her third attempt, it took her a staggering 12 hours to complete what should have been a 20-minute walk. It wasn't just her speed that was failing. Suzanne was also suffering from a severe throat issue that made it nearly impossible for her to swallow food. If a climber cannot eat, They cannot obtain the energy their muscles need to survive the extreme cold. Her guiding company, Glacier Himalayan Trek, and the government officers of Nepal clearly saw the impending disaster. They warned Suzanne 5 days before she died that she was not qualified to go any higher. They advised her to abandon the climb and leave the mountain for her own safety. But Suzanne refused to go. She argued that she had already paid her permit fees, which can cost up to $15,000, and insisted that she had to reach the top to set her world record. The situation on the mountain quickly escalated from a difficult climb into a very tense and public dispute. She took to Facebook to air her grievances, posting a shocking claim that the Sherpas she hired were torturing her with misadventure just to make her quit her mission. She felt they were being cruel and trying to ruin her record. But while Suzanne was typing on her phone, the Sherpas were looking at a woman who could barely breathe. They even posted a video showing her completely out of breath before she had even begun the real climbing. On Everest, being that exhausted at base camp is a dire sign that you will likely die if you ascend any higher. Eventually, Suzanne's painful throat issue worsened. If you can't eat, your muscles have no fuel. Without food, your body begins to break itself down just to keep your heart beating. You might also wonder if her pacemaker played a role in what happened. A pacemaker is a remarkable tool that helps a heart beat in a steady rhythm. However, even the best pacemaker cannot resolve the biggest problem on Everest, the severe lack of oxygen. At high altitudes, there is only 1/3 of the oxygen we breathe at sea level. Your heart has to work 3 times as hard just to keep you alive. For Suzanne, her heart was already struggling, and the thin air placed a massive strain on it that her pacemaker couldn't alleviate. Her heart was trying to pump blood that simply didn't have enough oxygen to keep her organs functioning. For 6 days, Suzanne remained at base camp, growing sicker and sicker. Her guiding company and government officers pleaded with her to leave for 5 straight days. But because she wouldn't go, the situation became a legal emergency. The police and government liaison officers had to be called to her tent. They determined they had to remove her by force because she was no longer thinking clearly. On Everest, when your brain doesn't receive enough air, you cannot always make safe decisions for yourself. On the evening of May 17, 2023, Suzanne was forcibly put onto a helicopter and flown from base camp to a hospital in the town of Lukla. She had only managed to reach an altitude of 5,800 meters, which is only about 450 meters higher than base camp. It was a tiny distance, but for her, it proved to be a fatal journey. Sadly, Suzanne passed away the next morning at 5:13 a.m., while doctors were trying to treat her in the hospital. She died from a combination of extreme exhaustion and high-altitude illness. When you are that tired and haven't eaten for days in thin air, your organs eventually just stop working. Her body simply could not handle the stress any longer. No amount of money or determination can make a body do something it isn't physically prepared for. Suzanne's story unfolded in a world of modern helicopters and hospitals. But almost 90 years ago, one man attempted to climb Everest with almost no gear, no oxygen, and a plan that seemed to emerge from a dream. Have you ever wondered if someone could climb the world's tallest peak with nothing but faith? Most people spend years training and thousands of dollars on the best gear to survive Mount Everest. But in 1934, a man named Maurice Wilson decided he would achieve what no one else could. He didn't have a team of experts. He didn't have oxygen tanks. He didn't even have a fully functional pair of arms. Maurice was a British soldier who had fought in the terrible trenches of World War I. He was an incredibly brave man who earned a medal called the Military Cross for his courage in battle. But the war left him with deep physical and emotional scars. He had been badly wounded by machine gun fire, and his left arm was mostly frozen in place, causing him sharp pain for the rest of his life. After the war ended, he couldn't find peace. He wandered from country to country, abandoning jobs and relationships because he felt like he was chasing a ghost. Then something happened that changed his life forever. Maurice became very sick with tuberculosis, a disease that attacks the lungs. He claimed that he met a mysterious man in London who told him he could heal himself through prayer and fasting. Maurice stopped eating for weeks and prayed every day. When he recovered, he became convinced that these spiritual tools were more powerful than any science or doctor. He decided he had a divine calling to climb Mount Everest alone, to prove to the world that faith could overcome any physical limit. But how do you climb a mountain when you have never even stepped on a glacier? Wilson's plan was so outlandish that his friends thought he was losing his mind. He didn't just want to walk to the mountain. He decided he would fly a small, second-hand airplane all the way from England to Everest. He named his plane Everest. His plan was to fly into Tibet, crash land the plane high on the side of the mountain at about 4,300 meters, and then simply step out and walk to the top. The biggest problem was that he wasn't a pilot, and he had never climbed a mountain in his life. He bought a Gypsy Moth biplane, a tiny aircraft made of wood and fabric. He took flying lessons, but he was a very slow learner. In fact, it took him twice the normal time just to obtain a pilot's license. Before he even departed for his trip, he crashed his plane into a hedge in England during a test flight. The government was so concerned that they banned him from flying to Everest. But Maurice didn't care about rules. Despite the ban, Maurice took off illegally on May 21, 1933. His flight was a series of improbable miracles. He didn't have proper maps for the desert, so he used a children's atlas to navigate. Imagine that, flying a plane over thousands of kilometers using a book meant for school kids. When he finally made it across India, the authorities were done playing games. They seized his plane and impounded it so he couldn't fly over Nepal. But Maurice Wilson was not a man who gave up easily. He spent the entire winter in a town called Darjeeling, where he fasted and meticulously planned his next move. While there, he met 3 Sherpas, Tewang, Renzing, and Zering, who had worked on previous Everest expeditions. They were impressed by his spirit and agreed to help him. But there was one more problem. Tibet was a forbidden country, and foreigners weren't allowed to enter. In March 1934, they devised a clever trick. They all donned disguises and dressed as Buddhist monks so they could sneak across the border illegally. Maurice even pretended to be deaf, mute, and very sick, so he wouldn't have to speak to anyone who might grow suspicious. They carried their gear in secret boxes, even hiding a compass inside a prayer wheel and a thermometer inside a monk's staff. They walked for 300 meters through the frozen mountains until they reached the Rongbuk Monastery at the very foot of Everest. Maurice stayed at the monastery for only 2 days before heading out onto the mountain alone. He didn't have the right boots or an ice axe. He even found a pair of crampons, the metal spikes for walking on ice that a previous team had left behind. But do you know what he did? He threw them away because he didn't understand how to use them. His first attempt was a total disaster. Maurice didn't understand how glaciers worked. He saw towering ice formations that looked like giants, and he got lost among them for days. He didn't know how to cross the deep cracks in the ice called crevasses. After 5 days of battling a freezing blizzard, he was exhausted and had a badly twisted ankle. He was also suffering from snow blindness, which occurs when the sun's reflection off the snow severely burns your eyes, causing temporary blindness. He managed to crawl back to the monastery, where he stayed in bed for 18 days to recover. He wrote in his diary, "It's the weather that's beaten me. What damn bad luck." Most people would have gone home, but Maurice believed that the bad luck was just a test of his faith. On May 12th, he ventured back out for a second try. This time, his Sherpas helped him reach a higher camp near the bottom of a giant ice wall called the North Pole. They found some leftover food that had been left there by an earlier expedition, and Maurice was so hungry he actually broke his fast to eat it. He felt energized and put on a bright blue mantle with gold buttons and a 7-meter-long red silk scarf. He looked more like a prince than a climber. But when the Sherpas looked at the steep, icy slope above them, They knew it was a death sentence. They begged him to turn back. Maurice refused. He told them that if he didn't return in 2 weeks, they should assume he was dead. On May 29th, 1934, he set off completely alone toward the peak. He was 36 years old. He believed that if he could just reach the top, he would signal the monks below using a small shaving mirror to show them that faith was real. He spent several days trying to cut steps into the ice with his axe, but he was too weak. His last diary entry on May 31st simply read, "Off again. Gorgeous day." Maurice Wilson was never seen alive again. A year later, another British expedition led by Eric Shipton found his body lying in the snow. He was on his side next to his broken tent, which had been torn to pieces by the wind. He was still wrapped in his sleeping bag, appearing as though he was just taking a nap. Shipton found Maurice's green diary in his backpack. It told the complete story of a man who tried to conquer the mountain with nothing but his beliefs. Maurice didn't die because he wasn't brave. He died because he didn't respect the mountain. He thought his dream was more important than the laws of nature, and Everest proved him tragically wrong.